Hi everyone, in this video we are going to be discussing the progressive movement. So we're going to be covering a lot of TEKS today. We are going to be analyzing civil service reform. We're also going to analyze the social gospel and evaluate the impact of initiative, referendum, and recall and the 17th Amendment. We will also evaluate the impact of muckrakers and identify the contributions of Jane Addams to American society. When we are finished, you will begin to conduct research on leaders of the progressive era in preparation for a speed dating game that we are going to be playing in class. Let's start with defining the progressive movement. The progressive era began around 1900 and ended in 1920. The progressive movement is the period between 1900 and World War I. This is the period of widespread social activism and political reform in the United States. The goal of the progressive movement is to eliminate problems that were caused by industrialization and urbanization and immigration and the political corruption that existed during the Gilded Age. So the roots of the progressive movement come from the social gospel movement. This was a movement that was spearheaded by Protestants, and they called for social reforms, things like the abolition of child labor and safer working conditions in factories. They were against unregulated free enterprise, and they also emphasized that Christians had a moral duty to help people who were less fortunate. The progressive movement also borrowed ideas from socialism. Socialists demanded an end to the free enterprise system in the United States, otherwise known as capitalism. They also believed that the government should take over basic industries, things like the railroads and utilities. They were not communists because communists believe that workers should seize control of factories by force or by abolishing all private property. So socialists believe in government ownership of some things, but not everything like communists do. And there's also influence taken from the muckrakers during the progressive era. Muckrakers are investigative journalists who expose the corruption and scandal or the muck that existed in politics and public affairs. Some of the famous muckrakers include the following. Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, and in it he included photographs of the conditions of the poor people in American cities. Here are some images of the conditions in the tenements that these immigrants lived in. As you can see, they lived in small rooms. The kitchen and bedroom were all in one small room that like 7 or maybe a dozen people had to share. Children were living in these crowded conditions that were unsanitary, often lacked things like shoes and adequate clothing. Alright, so another muckraker is Ida Tarbell. So Ida Tarbell wrote a book titled The History of the Standard Oil Company, and in it she exposed how Rockefeller had gained all of his money by ruthless business practices, by taking advantage of poor people and his workers, and also putting competition out of business by bribing railroad companies to give them better rates and things like that. Then we have Lincoln Steffens. So Lincoln Steffens wrote a book called The Shame of Cities, and in it he exposed the corruption in city governments. Next we have Frank Norris. Frank Norris wrote a book called The Octopus. It was a fictional book, but it talked about how railroads had this stranglehold over California farmers, and railroads really drove down the prices of crops or had a monopoly over the shipping industry in those areas. Lastly, we have Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle. He described in his book how the meatpacking industry in Chicago had very unsanitary practices, and he was probably one of the most famous muckrakers of the time because it really grossed people out to read some of the things that he witnessed in the meatpacking industry. Here is a little excerpt from Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. Here he portrays the new industrial economy as inhumane, destructive, and uncaring. In one scene of the book, he describes how piles of rat-infested, rotting meat was being used to make sausages that are then sold to consumers and eaten. He says the meat would be shoveled into carts, and then the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, and so they made a practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. How do you think a reader in 1906 would react to this passage in a book? You're going to answer this question, and we will discuss it in class. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the social reformers of the time. Jane Addams was known as the mother of social work. She was a reformer, she was a social worker, she also was an author, and she was a suffragist. She fought for the right of women to vote. She was the founder of Hull House. So Hull House was a settlement house in Chicago. These started kind of springing up in immigrant communities. And what they did at the Hull House was provide services to immigrants, things like childcare, nursing services, and even English lessons, so that they could assimilate to American society. And it was all run by volunteers. We have Ida B. Wells. Don't confuse her with Ida Tarbell. Ida B. Wells had 3 friends who were lynched for murders that they did not commit. So she organized an anti-lynching crusade, and she exposed that in the United States, 728 African American men or women had been lynched in a period of 10 years. W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African-American man to earn a PhD or a doctorate from Harvard, and he founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Du Bois was very outspoken for racial equality, and he demanded that African Americans be granted immediate equality. Remember that during this time period, African Americans are living under Jim Crow laws in the South and do not get to enjoy the same freedoms that white Americans did. And then you have Booker T. Washington. He's also an advocate for African American rights, but he had a different approach. He wanted gradual racial equality. He said that immediate equality was not possible, and that African Americans should focus on getting job training and not be too demanding of white people. So W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington had very different outlooks on what was possible for racial equality at the time. Okay, so let's talk about some of the municipal reforms. First, you need to know what a municipal government is. A municipal government is a town or city level of government. So a lot of the reforms began there. Reformers started to replace those political bosses and those political machines with public-minded mayors who actually wanted to work for the people. And they started to expand city services, and they also took direct ownership of some of the utilities to keep prices low. And then the state governments started to reform as well. One example is Robert La Follette, who was the governor of Wisconsin. He actually challenged political bosses in his state. He was successful, and he helped to reduce the influence of railroad owners in his state as well. In the states, we also see the introduction of what we call initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative is when voters have the ability to introduce bills and vote on them. So no longer do bills have to come from legislatures. The voters themselves, if they have enough support, can introduce bills and have the people of the state vote on them. Through referendum, voters were then able to force legislators to put the bills on the ballot. And lastly, recall. Through recall, the voters of the state have the power to hold elected officials accountable and remove them if they are unsatisfied. They can have a special election to remove someone from office. In the states, we also see the passage of secret ballots. So with a secret ballot, voters are less likely to be intimidated or pressured into voting a certain way. And then we also begin to see direct party primaries. So party primaries are actually special elections that are held prior to a general election, and people of the state get to choose which candidate they want to run in the general election. And then finally we have the 17th Amendment. So the 17th Amendment was passed during the Progressive Era, and what it did is it changed the way that senators were elected to the Senate. Instead of having state legislatures choose their own senators, which was usually done in corrupt ways, the people of the state get to vote for their senators now. Let's talk about some of the laws that were passed thanks to the progressive reformers. We're going to see state laws that are going to regulate the conditions in urban housing. So they're going to demand that there is adequate plumbing, that there is adequate heating, and things like that. They're also going to abolish child labor. They are going to regulate working conditions within the factories, demanding that people wear protective gear, that machines be fenced off so people don't get injured. Some of these laws will also limit the number of hours that women can work, and they are also going to force employers to compensate people who get injured on the job. And the civil service of the United States was also reformed during this time period. So remember that we talked about patronage or the spoils system. That is when government jobs are used as rewards for political contributions. Well, the Pendleton Act is going to be put in place to stop that. So it's going to create a civil service commission, and what it does is that it also gives competitive exams to people who want to serve in the government. And if people pass this exam, they are going to be granted their position based on merit, not on a political contribution, or based on they know someone in a powerful position who gave them the job. This is still in place today. So if someone wanted to become, for example, a border patrol agent, they would have to take a test and pass it in order to work for the federal government. So this is what the Pendleton Act put in place. And that brings us to the end of the lecture. If you guys have any questions, bring them to class, and thank you for watching.